The air in this Minnesota lodge isn't just cold. It carries the weight of 1,000 whispers. As a manager, I learned that the creaks weren't just old wood, but the restless movements of the lost. My nights were a silent dance of specific offerings and chilling observances, all dictated by Rule 7, a desperate attempt to contain the spectral residents and keep their mournful presence from extending beyond the lodge's isolated confines. To understand how I ended up trapped in this frozen purgatory, you have to understand the allure of the Northwoods. It calls to a specific type of broken person. I wasn't running from the law, but I was running from the noise of a life that had collapsed under the weight of divorce and corporate burnout. When the job listing for the Blackwood Pines Lodge popped up on a dusty corner of the internet, it looked like salvation, remote, it said. Winter caretaker and manager needed. Must be comfortable with solitude. I thought solitude was exactly what I needed. I didn't realize that in places like Blackwood Pines, you are never truly alone. The drive up Interstate 35, transitioning onto the winding, ice-slick county roads north of Duluth, felt like a descent into another world. The trees grew taller, darker, crowding the asphalt like silent sentinels. By the time my tires crunched onto the gravel driveway of the lodge, the sun was already bleeding out behind the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The lodge itself was a Gothic behemoth of timber and stone, built in the roaring 20s by a mining magnate who, rumor had it, went mad before the roof was even finished. It sat on the edge of a frozen lake that looked less like water and more like a vast, unblinking eye staring up at the gray sky. My welcome was efficient and strangely hurried. The outgoing manager, a man named Henderson, who looked like he hadn't slept in a month, didn't offer me coffee. He didn't offer pleasantries. He shoved a heavy ring of keys into my hand and pointed toward the office. His bags were already packed, sitting by the heavy oak front doors as if he were ready to sprint. The boiler is temperamental. Henderson said, his voice tight. Keep the thermostat at 68. No lower. The pipes scream if it gets too cold. Got it, I said, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. The lobby was magnificent but oppressive. A massive stone fireplace dominated the room, cold ash sitting in the grate. Mounted deer heads stared down with glass eyes that seemed to track my movement. Anything else I should know? The listing mentioned a staff of 3. Mrs. Gable handles housekeeping. Ben does the grounds. They live in the cabins out back. They don't come into the main lodge after sundown, ever. Henderson's eyes darted to the grand staircase, spiraling up into the gloom of the second floor. Arthur, listen to me. On the desk, there is a binder, red leather. It contains the operational protocols. Read them. Memorize them. Do not deviate. I chuckled, a nervous sound that died quickly in the cavernous room. Strict corporate policy? Henderson didn't laugh. He gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging into my coat. It's not corporate. It's survival, especially Rule 7. If you think it's a joke, you're dead. Do you understand me? You follow Rule 7 to the letter. Before I could ask what the hell he was talking about, he grabbed his bags and bolted. I watched through the frosted glass of the front door as his taillights faded into the treeline, leaving me standing in the silence of a building that felt like it was holding its breath. The first few hours were mundane, almost disappointingly so. I unpacked my meager belongings in the manager's quarters, a suite located behind the front desk. I toured the kitchen, the ballroom, the library. The place was a museum of dust and faded grandeur. It was beautiful, in a melancholic way. But as the darkness outside deepened, pressing against the windows like a physical weight, the atmosphere inside shifted. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. It buzzed in my ears, a low-frequency static that made my teeth ache. I found the binder Henderson had mentioned sitting in the center of the mahogany desk in the office. It was heavy, the leather worn smooth by countless hands. I poured myself a drink, cheap whiskey I'd brought from the city, and sat down under the glow of the green banker's lamp. The first few pages were standard. Rule 1, lock the main gates at 10 p.m. Rule 2, check the boiler pressure every 4 hours. Rule 3, Ensure the kitchen gas lines are sealed. I flipped through them, feeling a mix of relief and boredom. Henderson had just been a burnt-out guy trying to scare the new blood. Just as I was about to close the book, I turned the page to a section separated by a black tab. Rule 7. Containment Protocols. The text here was handwritten, unlike the typed font of the previous pages. The handwriting changed every few paragraphs, different styles, different inks, as if added to by generations of managers. The residents of Blackwood Pines are not to be disturbed, but they must be acknowledged. Failure to acknowledge leads to breach. Breach leads to expansion. I frowned, leaning closer. Subsection A. At 11:45 p.m., place a saucer of warm milk. Must be whole milk, warm to exactly 100 degrees. On the mantel of the lobby fireplace. Do not look into the mirror above the mantel while doing this. Subsection B. The hallway on the 3rd floor, specifically the east wing, is to be walked backwards from the hours of 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. if transit is required. Do not turn your back to the end of the hall. Subsection C. If you hear the piano in the ballroom, do not investigate. Close the office door. Turn on the radio to a static frequency. Wait until the music stops. I laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. It was ridiculous. It had to be an initiation prank, an elaborate hazing ritual for the new guy. Warm milk? Walking backwards? I muttered, shaking my head. Christ, Henderson, you really sold it. I slammed the book shut and stood up. I was a rational man. I believed in spreadsheets, profit margins, and plumbing. I did not believe in ghosts that wanted warm milk. I decided to do a final patrol before turning in. The lodge was vast, a labyrinth of shadows. I walked through the lobby, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath plumbing in the air despite the thermostat reading 68. I was checking the lock on the library door when I heard it. Thump. It came from directly above me, the 2nd floor. I froze. The lodge was empty. Mrs. Gable and Ben were in their cabins, 100 yards away. I had locked the doors myself. Thump. Drag. Thump. It sounded like someone wearing a heavy boot dragging a paralyzed leg across the floorboards. The rhythm was uneven, wet, and heavy. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small, pathetic. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered me. But it wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. Rationality, I told myself. It's the pipes. It's the wood settling in the cold. I marched toward the stairs, determined to prove my logic right. I climbed the grand staircase, the wood groaning under my feet. The 2nd floor corridor stretched out into darkness. The air up here smelled different. Downstairs, it smelled of pine and lemon polish. Up here, it smelled of stale lavender and something metallic, like old copper, like dried blood. I swept the light across the hallway. Nothing. Just row after row of numbered doors. I walked down the hall, checking each handle. Locked, locked, locked. Then I reached room 204. The door was slightly ajar. I felt a cold prickle of sweat on the back of my neck. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had locked this room during my initial tour 3 hours ago. I pushed the door open with the toe of my boot. The beam of my light hit the center of the room. It was empty. The bed was stripped, the mattress bare. But in the center of the floor, sitting perfectly upright, was a single wooden children's block. I stepped into the room, heart hammering against my ribs. I knelt down to inspect the block. It was old, the paint chipped. It showed the letter G. As I reached out to touch it, the door behind me slammed shut. The sound was like a gunshot. I spun around, fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't turn. It wasn't locked. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. "Hey," I shouted, pounding on the wood. "Open this door." From the other side of the door, right against the wood, a voice whispered. It was dry, raspy, like dead leaves skittering on pavement. "Rule 7, Arthur. You didn't warm the milk." The temperature in the room plummeted. My flashlight flickered and died. In the pitch black, I could hear breathing in the corner of the room. It wasn't mine. It was wet, ragged, and it was getting closer. I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter, my hand shaking so violently I dropped it twice. The breathing was right next to my ear now. I flicked the flint. The flame sparked to life, a tiny island of orange light. Standing inches from my face was a woman. Her skin was gray, like wet clay. Her eyes were sewn shut with thick black thread. She wore a maid's uniform from the turn of the century, stained dark around the collar. She tilted her head, the threads pulling at her dead skin. "The milk," she hissed. I screamed and threw my shoulder against the door. The resistance was gone. I tumbled out into the hallway, scrambling on my hands and knees, the lighter falling from my grip and extinguishing. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran blindly down the corridor, practically falling down the stairs, not stopping until I was back in the safety of the office with the heavy oak door bolted shut. I sat with my back against the door, hyperventilating, clutching a letter opener as a weapon. I waited for them to come through the door. I waited for the police to show up. I waited for anything that made sense. But nothing came. The lodge returned to its oppressive silence. I looked at the clock on the wall. 11:55 p.m. I had missed the window for the milk. My eyes darted to the red binder on the desk. My skepticism lay shattered somewhere upstairs in room 204. My hands were trembling as I crawled toward the desk and ripped the binder open. I ignored the gas lines. I ignored the boiler. I flipped frantically to the black tab. I needed to know what happened when you broke the rules. I needed to know how to fix it. I found the addendum at the bottom of the page, written in a frantic, jagged scrawl that looked disturbingly like Henderson's handwriting. "If a ritual is missed, do not attempt to perform it late. It is an insult. Instead, you must perform the penance of salt. Go to the kitchen. Cover the threshold of the office in a continuous line of salt. Do not step over it until sunrise. They will scratch at the door. They will beg to come in. They might even sound like people you know. Do not break the line." I ran to the kitchen. It was a blur of terror. I found a canister of industrial iodized salt. I sprinted back to the office, my heart feeling like it was going to burst. As I began to pour the white crystals across the doorway, the scratching started. It wasn't aggressive. It was gentle. Fingernails lightly dragging down the wood of the office door. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Then a voice. Not the raspy whisper of the woman upstairs. This voice was familiar. It sounded like my ex-wife. "Arthur?" The voice called from the lobby, muffled by the door. "Arthur, honey, let me in. It's freezing out here. I just want to talk." I squeezed my eyes shut, pouring the salt thicker, praying the line was unbroken. "Arthur, please," the voice pleaded, turning into a sob. "It hurts. It's so cold." I backed away into the corner of the office, watching the door handle jiggle, just slightly. Up and down, up and down. I stayed there all night, watching the handle, listening to the voices cycle through everyone I had ever loved, begging for entry. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, bathing the room in pale, gray light, the scratching stopped. The voices vanished. I stood up, my legs stiff, my body aching. I walked to the door and looked at the salt line. It was undisturbed. But on the other side of the glass panel of the office door, there were smudge marks. Hundreds of them. Handprints. Small ones. Large ones. Some that looked like claws. They covered every inch of the glass. I wasn't the manager anymore. I was the jailer. And I had just survived my first shift. But as I looked at the red binder, I realized with a sinking dread that Rule 7 had dozens of subsections. And tonight, I had to be perfect. Because looking at those handprints, I knew one thing for certain. The things in this lodge didn't just want to scare me. They wanted to get out. And I was the only thing standing in their way. The morning sun didn't burst through the windows of Blackwood Pines, it oozed. The light was a pale, sickly yellow that did little to warm the frozen glass or dispel the lingering shadows of the previous night. I was still sitting in the corner of the office, the letter opener clutched in a hand that had gone numb hours ago. The salt line I had frantically poured across the threshold was still there, a white scar against the dark oak floor, but the handprints on the glass had faded with the rising sun, leaving behind greasy smears that looked disturbingly like ectoplasm. I felt brittle, as if a strong gust of wind would shatter me into 1,000 pieces. The terror of the night had receded, replaced by a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. The sound of a vacuum cleaner snapped me back to reality. It was a mundane, domestic roar that felt alien in the context of what I had just survived. I scrambled to my feet, my joints popping, and threw open the office door. Standing in the lobby, pushing an industrial vacuum with the grim determination of a soldier clearing a minefield, was a woman I assumed to be Mrs. Gable. She was short, stout, and wore a gray uniform that seemed to blend into the walls. She didn't look up as I stumbled out, merely steering the machine around a grand armchair. "You made a mess," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying a heavy Midwestern accent that sounded bizarrely comforting. She pointed a thick finger at the salt line. "Ben hates getting salt out of the floorboards. Grits up the varnish." I stared at her, my mouth gaping like a fish. "The salt? You're worried about the salt, Mrs. Gable." There were things at the door. My wife's voice. A woman with her eyes sewn shut. I was rambling, hysteria bubbling up in my throat. I almost died in there. Mrs. Gable finally looked at me. Her eyes were hard, the color of flint, but there was a flicker of pity deep within them. She clicked the vacuum off. The sudden silence was deafening. "You didn't die, Mr. Arthur. You survived. Which means you read the addendum. Most of the new ones don't make it to the salt. They open the door." She shivered, a small involuntary movement. "Coffee's in the kitchen. Strong. You'll need it. Ben is waiting." She turned back to her work, the roar of the vacuum dismissing me. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my mind reeling. The normalcy of her reaction was more terrified than the screaming would have been. If this was just a Tuesday for them, what the hell had I signed up for? The kitchen was a cavernous space of stainless steel and white tile, smelling of bacon grease and old copper. Sitting at a butcher block table was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the local bedrock. Ben, the groundskeeper, was massive, with a beard that hung to his chest and hands that looked like they could crush a bowling ball. He was nursing a mug of coffee, staring at a specific spot on the wall. He didn't look at me as I entered. "Sit." Ben grunted, sliding a mug across the table. It sloshed dark liquid onto the wood. "Drink." I sat. The coffee was bitter and scalding, but the heat grounded me. "You knew," I accused, my voice trembling. "Henderson, you. Mrs. Gable. You all knew what this place is." Ben slowly turned his head. His face was a map of scars and sun damage. "We know what lives here. We know the rules." Henderson was weak. He started skipping the little things. A minute late here, a forgotten offering there. The walls started whispering to him during the day. He got out before they made him open a window. Ben leaned forward, his bulk casting a shadow over me. "But you missed the milk on night one. That's bold, kid. Or stupid." I thought it was a joke. I whispered. "A hazing ritual. The dead don't have a sense of humor," Ben said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble. "Listen to me closely. This lodge, it isn't just a building. It's a cage, a containment vessel, built on land that the native tribes avoided for 1,000 years. The man who built it, Blackwood, he thought he could harness the energy here. Instead, he cracked the door open. Rule 7 isn't about housekeeping. It's about keeping the latch on that door. This was the revelation, the unveiling of the nightmare logic that governed my new life. I listened, entranced and horrified, as Ben explained the true nature of Rule 7. It wasn't just a list of chores. It was a complex metaphysical lock system. The entities trapped within the lodge, the lost souls, as the staff called them, were not merely ghosts. They were fragments of something older, wearing the faces of those who had died here to mock the living. They were hungry, restless, and constantly testing the boundaries of their prison. Every ritual corresponds to a seal. Ben continued, tracing a pattern on the table with his calloused finger. The warm milk. It's an offering to the spirit of the hearth, the entity that controls the temperature. You miss it, the cold gets in. The cold allows them to manifest physically. You saw the woman in 204. That's the least of your worries. If the temperature drops below freezing inside the lodge, the barriers fail completely. Then, they don't just scratch at the door. They come through it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. So, I'm a jailer. You're a damn keeper. Ben corrected. Holding back a flood. And tonight, the water is going to be higher. Because you showed them weakness. They know you're afraid. They'll test you harder. That was the moment the reality set in. I wasn't leaving. I couldn't. Ben explained that the contract I signed had a clause. Fine print I had ignored, about a mandatory probationary period of 6 months. If I left, I forfeited my salary, my severance from my old life, everything. But more than that, Ben implied something darker. Once you start the rituals, he said, staring into his coffee, you're marked. If you leave without passing the stewardship to a successor, they follow you. Henderson made it to the county line before he saw the maid in his rearview mirror. He came back an hour later to hand you the keys. He's safe now, only because you took the burden. I was trapped, bound by ink and blood. Ben stood up, his knees cracking. Come on, I need to show you the basement. You need to see where the noise comes from. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to run to my car. But the image of the woman with the sewn eyes flashed in my mind. If they could follow me, I had to stay. I had to master the rules. The descent into the basement was a journey into the throat of the beast. The stairs were steep, narrow, and made of rotting wood that felt spongy underfoot. The air grew heavy, smelling of damp earth and ozone. Ben led me to a heavy iron door at the far end of the boiler room. It was covered in rust, but the hinges were freshly oiled. Rule 7, subsection D, Ben said, pointing to the door, checking the locks, twice a night. Once at 3 a.m., once at 4:33 a.m. exactly. What's behind it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The root cellar, Ben said. Or it used to be. Now? It's the throat. As if on cue, a massive bang resonated from the other side of the iron door. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting the metal. I jumped back, nearly tripping over a pile of coal. The door didn't budge, but the rust flaked off, drifting to the floor like dried blood. Bang, bang, bang. The rhythm was angry, insistent. Don't speak to it, Ben warned, gripping my arm painfully. Whatever you hear, don't answer. It mimics. It learns. Last month, it sounded like a crying baby. The month before that, it sounded like Mrs. Gable screaming for help. If you open that door, Arthur, there is no salt line in the world that can save you. We stood there in the damp dark, the banging echoing in our chests. It was a stark reminder that the horror here wasn't ethereal or ghostly. It was physical, violent, and incredibly strong. This was the spike in my heart, the moment the fear turned from a cold fluid into a solid, jagged stone in my gut. This wasn't a haunt. It was a siege. And I was the commander of a fortress I didn't understand. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic preparation. My skepticism was dead and buried. In its place was a desperate, studious panic. I spent hours with the red binder, memorizing every syllable of Rule 7. I learned that the hallways weren't just corridors, they were arteries that needed to be kept clear. I learned that the mirrors were windows that needed to be curtained at specific times. I met Mrs. Gable in the laundry room as she was folding sheets with military precision. The linen for the West Wing, she said, not looking up. Rule 7, subsection F. The sheets in room 302 must be changed daily, even if no one sleeps there. They soil them. I didn't ask how. I didn't want to know. And Arthur, she added, pausing for the first time. She looked at me, her face pale. Tonight is Tuesday. Tuesdays are for the boy. I flipped through the binder in my mind. The boy? I didn't see a subsection for a boy. It's an unwritten addendum. Subsection G. We don't write it down because writing it gives him power. You just have to know. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. In the ballroom, under the grand piano, there is a loose floorboard. You must place a toy soldier there, a specific one. It's in the desk drawer. Lead paint, missing a rifle. Place it there at exactly midnight. Then walk away. Do not run. If you run, he thinks you're playing tag, and he hates to lose. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the snow outside. The lodge seemed to wake up as the light died. The timbers groaned. The wind howling down the chimney sounded like distant screaming. Ben and Mrs. Gable left promptly at 4:30 p.m., retreating to their cabins. I watched them go with a pang of intense jealousy and abandonment. They were leaving me alone in the belly of the whale. At 10 p.m., I locked the main gates. My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I checked the boiler. Pressure stable. Temperature 68. At 11 p.m., I went to the kitchen. I warmed the milk. I used a thermometer, watching the red line climb. 98, 99, 100. I snatched it off the heat instantly. I poured it into the saucer, not spilling a drop. I walked to the lobby, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to look at the mirror above the mantel. I placed the saucer down. Slurp. The sound came from the fireplace before my hand had even retracted. I didn't flinch. I didn't look. I turned and walked away, my back stiff. Success. But the night was young, and the boy was waiting. Midnight approached. I retrieved the lead soldier from the desk drawer. It was heavy, cold, and felt malevolent in my palm. The paint was chipped, revealing the dull gray metal underneath. The missing rifle made the soldier look like he was surrendering. I walked to the ballroom. The room was massive, the moonlight streaming through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The grand piano sat in the center like a black coffin. I approached it, my footsteps echoing loudly on the hardwood. Click-clack, click-clack. I knelt by the piano. I found the loose floorboard. I pried it up with my fingernails. Beneath, there was a dark cavity. It smelled of rot and old candy, sweet and sickening. I placed the soldier into the darkness. Here, I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. For you, I replaced the board. I stood up. Do not run, Mrs. Gable had said. He thinks you're playing tag. I turned around and began to walk toward the double doors. 1 step. 2 steps. From behind me, under the piano, came a giggle. It was a wet, bubbling sound. You broke it, a child's voice whispered. It sounded like it was right next to my ear. I froze. I hadn't broken anything. The soldier was already broken. You gave me the broken one. The voice petulant now, angry. I don't want the broken one. I want yours. A cold wind swept through the ballroom, extinguishing the candles I hadn't even lit. The heavy lid of the piano slammed down with a crash that shook the floor. Slam. I didn't run. I forced my legs to move in a measured, terrified cadence. Walk. Just walk. Behind me, I heard the scuff of small, bare feet on the wood. Fast. Skittering. Tag. The voice whispered. You're it. Something small and hard hit the back of my leg. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming, tasting blood. I kept walking. I reached the doors, pushed them open, and stepped into the hallway, closing them firmly behind me. I leaned against the wood, gasping for air. I waited for the doors to burst open. I waited for the boy to come through. Silence. I looked down at the floor. Rolling away from my feet, spinning in a perfect circle, was a marble. A glass cat's eye. It stopped against the opposite wall, staring at me. I had survived the boy, but as I looked at my watch, I realized it was only 12:15 a.m. The night stretched out before me like a black ocean, and up on the third floor, in the east wing, something heavy dragged itself across the floorboards, waking up for its turn. Rule 7, subsection B was next, the backward walk. I picked up the marble, my fingers burning from the cold of the glass, and put it in my pocket. A souvenir, or maybe a warning. As I turned toward the stairs, the lights in the hallway flickered and buzzed. The static from the bulbs seemed to form words. He likes you. I gripped the banister, my knuckles white. The fear was different tonight. It wasn't the blind panic of the uninitiated. It was the heavy, crushing dread of the knowing. I knew the game now. I knew the players. And I knew that tonight they were changing the rules just to see if I would break. I started the climb to the third floor, walking backward up the stairs, my eyes fixed on the darkness below, praying that nothing would emerge from the shadows to catch me. The lodge settled around me, the wood groaning in anticipation. The night shift had only just begun. The human mind is a terrifyingly adaptable machine. Put a man in a cell, and he learns to count the bricks. Put him in a war zone, and he learns to sleep through mortar fire. Put him in Blackwood Pines Lodge, and he learns that 2:14 a.m. is the exact time he must hold his breath while walking past the grandfather clock in the library, lest the thing living inside the pendulum hears the air entering his lungs. It had been 3 weeks since I took the keys from Henderson's trembling hands. 3 weeks of nocturnal gymnastics, arcane chemistry, and psychological warfare. The terror hadn't vanished. Fear is the fuel that keeps you sharp, but it had transformed. The sharp, jagged panic of that first night had ground down into a dull, heavy ache in the center of my chest. I wasn't screaming anymore. I was working. My life had shrunk to the boundaries of Rule 7. The red binder was my Bible, my Constitution, and my death warrant. I knew it better than I knew the lines on my own face, which, when I caught glimpses of it in the few uncovered mirrors, looked increasingly like a stranger's. My eyes were sunken, rimmed with purple bruises of exhaustion. My skin had taken on the pallor of the winter sky, gray and lifeless. I was becoming part of the lodge's ecosystem, another fixture like the gargoyles on the eaves or the stag heads on the wall. The routine was brutal in its precision. My shift began at sundown. The transition from day to night at Blackwood Pines was violent. The shadows didn't just lengthen, they stretched out like grasping fingers, seizing the hallways. At 9 p.m., I performed the opening of the way, a ritual I had named myself, though the book simply called it subsection C4. I had to go to the scullery, retrieve a specific iron key that was always ice cold to the touch, and lock the internal door to the basement. It was already locked, of course. It was always locked. But the ritual required me to unlock it, wait 3 seconds, and lock it again. Click. 1, 2, 3. Clack. During those 3 seconds, the air pressure in the room would drop. My ears would pop. I would hear the sound of wet footsteps slapping against the concrete stairs below, rushing upward. I had to turn the key at the exact moment the footsteps reached the top step. Too early, and the lock wouldn't engage. Too late, and, well, the book didn't say. It just had a diagram of a man with no face. By 11 p.m., the lodge was fully awake. The pipe sang a chorus of groans and hisses. The floorboards settled with sounds that mimicked human footsteps. But I knew the difference now. House noises were rhythmic, caused by thermal expansion. Their noises were syncopated, deliberate. They paused when you stopped moving. They sped up when you turned your back. I moved through the west wing, a tray in my hands. On it sat a silver thimble filled with whiskey, a dried rose petal, and a single pristine copper penny dated 1945. These were for Mr. Sterling. I had learned about the residence from Ben during our grim morning coffees. Mr. Sterling had been a guest in the 1940s, a war profiteer who had come to the lodge to hide his ill-gotten gains. He had choked to death on a piece of steak in the library, alone, while hoarding his wealth. Now, he haunted the third stack of the library, obsessively counting money that wasn't there. I entered the library. The smell of old paper and dust was overwhelmed by the scent of ozone. The smell of a thunderstorm trapped indoors. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice was steady, stripped of emotion. The rules stated I had to be polite. Subsection F, courtesy binds the guest. I walked to the third stack. The books here were rearranged every night. Sometimes they were stacked in towers. Sometimes they were thrown across the floor. Tonight, they were arranged in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle lay a dead bird, a cardinal. Its red feathers were shockingly bright against the dark rug. I didn't react. Reaction is recognition, and recognition gives them power. I stepped over the bird, kneeling by the designated floorboard. I placed the penny heads up. I set the thimble of whiskey beside it. I placed the rose petal on top of the penny. "Your dividends, sir," I whispered. From the shadows of the bookshelf, a hand emerged. It was translucent, blue-veined, and trembling. It hovered over the offerings. I didn't look at the face that I knew was peering around the spine of a leather-bound encyclopedia. I knew that if I looked, I would see a face purple with asphyxiation, eyes bulging in eternal panic. I backed away, keeping my head bowed. The coin clinked against the wood. The whiskey vanished from the thimble in a blink, leaving the silver dry. "Accepted," a watery voice gargled. I exhaled, a plume of white vapor escaping my lips. 1 down, 7 to go. The nights were a series of these checkpoints. The milk for the maid, the soldier for the boy, the silence for the walker. But the most taxing part of the night was the silent observance required between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. This was the chilling calm Ben had warned me about. For 1 hour, the lodge went completely silent. The wind outside seemed to die. The boiler stopped rattling. The spirits ceased their scratching and whispering. It was a vacuum of sound, heavy and oppressive. During this hour, I had to patrol the perimeter of the second floor. I had to walk the entire square circuit of the hallway 3 times. I could not speak. I could not sneeze. I could not let my shoes squeak. And most importantly, I could not acknowledge the figures standing in the open doorways. They stood there every night. Shadowy silhouettes, backlit by the moonlight from the rooms. Some were tall, looming over the frames. Others were small, crouching on the floor. They didn't move. They just watched. Walking that gauntlet was a lesson in dissociation. I had to separate my mind from my body. My body was a machine moving through space. My mind was a fortress, locked tight. Left foot, right foot. Breathe shallow. Don't look left. Don't look right. As I passed room 217, I felt the cold radiate from the doorway like heat from an oven. Room 217 was occupied by something Mrs. Gable refused to name. She simply called it the Weaver. I could see it from the corner of my eye. A mass of limbs, too many for a human, tangled like a ball of yarn, suspended from the ceiling. It rotated slowly as I passed. Creak. I kept my eyes forward, fixing them on the painting of the stag at the end of the hall. Left foot. Right foot. Arthur. The whisper came from inside my own head. It wasn't a sound wave. It was a thought inserted into my brain. It sounded like my mother, who had been dead for 10 years. Arthur, look at me. I'm so cold. My step faltered. Just for a microsecond. My heel scuffed the carpet. Scritch. The silence of the lodge shattered. Every door in the hallway slammed shut simultaneously. Bang! The force of the air displacement knocked me to my knees. The lights in the hallway exploded, raining sparks and glass down on my head. Total darkness enveloped me. I froze on the floor, glass shards digging into my palms. I had breached the silence. I had broken the observance. Panic, hot and acidic, flooded my veins. I scrambled for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling with the switch. It clicked on, the beam cutting an erratic cone through the dust and darkness. The hallway was empty. The doors were closed. But the temperature was plummeting. I could feel the hairs on my arms freezing, snapping like dried twigs. I knew what came next. The escalation. When the silence is broken, the noise returns tenfold. From behind the door of room 217, a sound began. It was the sound of 1,000 flies buzzing. It grew louder, deeper, vibrating the floorboards against my chest. Then, the wood of the door began to bow outward, as if something massive was pushing against it from the inside. Not now, I hissed through gritted teeth. I don't have time for this. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I knew running was generally discouraged, but in the event of a breach during the silent observance, the rule book was clear. Retreat to the sanctuary. The sanctuary was the only room in the lodge that the spirits couldn't enter. The walk-in freezer in the kitchen. It was lined with copper mesh and blessed silver, hidden behind the industrial shelving. I sprinted down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. The lodge was screaming now. Pictures flew off the walls, shattering on the floor. The chandelier in the lobby swung violently, its crystals chiming like alarm bells. Shadows detached themselves from the corners, lunging at me with elongated claws. I burst into the kitchen, slid across the tiles, and threw myself at the heavy steel door of the freezer. I yanked the handle, dived inside, and slammed it shut, spinning the internal wheel to lock it. The noise cut off instantly. I was alone in the humming cold of the freezer, surrounded by racks of frozen meat and vegetables. My breath came in ragged gasps. I collapsed against a shelf, sliding down to the metal floor. I checked my watch. 2:45 a.m. I had 15 minutes until the observance period ended. I had to wait it out. As my heart rate slowed, I looked around the freezer. It was the one place that felt safe. But as I stared at the frost clinging to the cooling unit, I noticed something. Someone had been here before me. Recently, scratched into the frost on the metal wall of the freezer were words. They were fresh. The ice crystals hadn't reformed over the grooves yet. It's not containment. It's feeding. I stared at the words, my blood running cold. This wasn't Henderson's handwriting. It was jagged, frantic. It looked like Ben's. Feeding, I whispered. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We weren't jailers. We were waiters. The rituals, the offerings, the milk, the whiskey, the attention. We weren't suppressing the spirits. We were strengthening them. We were giving them energy, focusing their presence, keeping them tethered to this plane. Why? Why would anyone want to keep these things here? My mind raced back to the Blackwood family history I had skimmed in the library. Silas Blackwood hadn't just been a mining magnate. He was a grief-stricken father who had lost his entire family to Spanish flu. He had built the lodge not as a hotel, but as a mausoleum, a place to bridge the gap. Rule 7 wasn't a cage, it was an anchor. And by following the rules, by performing the rituals with such perfection, I was polishing the anchor chain. I was making them stronger. The handle of the freezer door spun. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the frozen carcasses of hanging venison. The wheel turned slowly, deliberately. It couldn't be opened from the outside when the internal lock was engaged. That was the design. Unless unless the person opening it had a key. Only 3 people had keys: me, Mrs. Gable, and Ben. The door groaned open. Standing in the threshold, framed by the darkness of the kitchen, was Ben. But it wasn't the Ben I knew. His eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. His mouth hung open in a slack, impossible gape. He held a fire axe in his right hand, the blade dragging on the tiles. "Ben?" I choked out. He didn't speak, but a voice came from his throat. A voice that sounded like grinding stones. "The master is hungry, Arthur, and you've done such a good job fattening us up." This was the twist of the knife, the betrayal of the mentor. Ben wasn't just a traumatized employee, he was a vessel. The long years of exposure had hollowed him out, and tonight something had decided to wear him. He stepped into the freezer. The cold didn't bother him. He raised the axe. I looked around frantically. There was no exit, just rows of frozen meat. "Ben, listen to me," I pleaded, holding my hands up. "Rule 7, subsection K, do not harm the staff." Ben paused. The logic of the rules seemed to struggle against the entity controlling him. The axe lowered an inch. "Rules," the voice grated. "Rules are for the keeper, not the kept." He swung. I threw myself to the right, slipping on the icy floor. The axe head buried itself in a side of beef, cleaving through bone with a wet crunch. While he struggled to dislodge it, I scrambled for the door. I squeezed past his massive bulk, feeling the radiating cold of the death that clung to him. I tumbled out into the kitchen, my boots scrabbling for traction. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the lobby, up the stairs, and into the office, slamming the bolt home. I backed away from the door, grabbing the red binder from the desk. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly tore the pages. I needed to find a countercurse, a banishment, something. I flipped past the rituals, past the offerings. I turned to the very back of the binder, past the pages I had never bothered to read because they were sealed with wax. I broke the wax seal. Protocol Omega, severance. In the event that the anchor becomes unstable or the vessel is compromised, the connection must be severed. This will release the energy accumulated within the lodge. Warning: survival rate of staff during severance is 0%. I stared at the page. The instructions were simple, brutal. Burn the lodge, but not just with fire, with a specific accelerant stored in the basement vault. The banging started on the office door. It wasn't scratching this time. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a fire axe. Thunk, thunk, thunk. "Arthur!" Ben's voice roared, shifting between his own baritone and the demon's gravel. "Open the door. Let us finish the ceremony." I looked at the window. Outside, the snow was falling heavily, a white curtain isolating me from the world. I looked at the door, splintering under the blows. I looked at the binder. I had spent 3 weeks keeping them in. Now, I had to figure out how to let them go without letting them take me with them. The wood of the door gave way. A hand reached through the jagged hole, groping for the deadbolt. I grabbed the letter opener and stabbed the hand. Ben howled, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. He yanked his hand back, and for a moment the assault stopped. I used the pause. I grabbed the binder, a flashlight, and the keys. I wasn't going to hide in the office. If Ben was between me and the basement, I had to find another way down. There was a dumbwaiter in the service hallway behind the office. It was small, cramped, and terrified me, but it led directly to the laundry room in the basement. I squeezed myself into the small wooden box of the dumbwaiter, pulling my knees to my chest. I cut the rope that held the counterweight. As I plummeted into the dark belly of the lodge, I realized that the chilling calm was over. The rituals had failed. The containment was broken. And Rule 7 had one final clause I had missed in my panic. The manager goes down with the ship. The dumbwaiter crashed into the basement floor, knocking the wind out of me. I tumbled out into the dark, smelling the wet earth and the rust. I was in their domain now, the roots of the house. And in the darkness, 100 eyes opened to greet me. "Welcome, Arthur," whispered the shadows. "We've been waiting for the main course." The impact of the dumbwaiter hitting the basement floor didn't just knock the wind out of me. It felt like it jarred my soul loose from my ribs. I lay there in the cramped wooden box for a moment, gasping for air that tasted of wet earth and ancient, settled dust. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes like a heavy velvet blindfold. My body was a roadmap of pain. Bruised shoulders, a bitten tongue, and the lingering phantom freeze of the freezer burn on my hands. But pain was good. Pain meant I was still biological. It meant I wasn't one of them yet. I kicked the door of the dumbwaiter open. It swung out with a rusty screech that echoed through the subterranean cavern like a dinner bell. I rolled out onto the concrete floor, fumbling for the flashlight I had managed to keep gripped in my hand. I clicked it on. The beam sputtered, yellow and weak, cutting a thin slice through the gloom. I was in the laundry sorting room. This was the deepest part of the lodge, a place I had only seen on the blueprints in the red binder. It was a concrete box filled with industrial hampers and massive, iron-bellied washing machines that looked like torture devices from a bygone era. The air here was different than upstairs. Upstairs, the cold was sharp and aggressive. Down here, it was damp and heavy, a suffocating blanket of moisture that smelled of mildew and something sweeter, like rotting lilies. As I tried to stand, bracing myself against one of the washing machines, the unit suddenly lurched to life. Thump slosh. Thump slosh. I recoiled, shining my light at the glass porthole of the machine. It was running a cycle, but there was no water inside. Instead, a thick, dark fluid churned against the glass, heavy and viscous. And tumbling within the black liquid were shapes that looked disturbingly like human clothes. Shredded uniforms, tattered dresses, but they moved with a solidity that suggested they were still occupied. Thump. A pale hand pressed against the glass from the inside, fingers splayed before being swept away into the dark vortex. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the slick floor. The basement wasn't just the foundation of the lodge, it was the stomach. This is where the energy went. All the milk, the whiskey, the attention, the fear, it all drained down here to fuel. Whatever this machinery was, I needed to find the vault. The Protocol Omega entry in the binder had been sparse on directions, but specific on location. The Arch of Silas, north wall, behind the cold chute. I navigated out of the laundry room and into the main corridor of the basement. The ceiling was low, draped with cobwebs that shivered in a draft that shouldn't exist underground. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, weeping condensation that trickled down like sweat. "Arthur?" The whisper came from the ventilation ducts overhead. It wasn't the deceptive, mimicking voice of the entities upstairs. This was different. It was a chorus, 100 voices layered over one another, speaking in unison. "Arthur, the fire is forbidden. The cold is safety. Shut up," I muttered, my voice cracking. I kept moving, sweeping the light back and forth. The shadows here were aggressive. They didn't just hide things. They seemed to reach out, snatching at my peripheral vision. I saw faces in the stone, screaming, silent mouths formed by the cracks in the mortar. I reached the boiler room. The massive iron furnace dominated the space, a sleeping dragon of cast iron. This was where I had stood with Ben just weeks ago, listening to the banging on the iron door. The iron door. Rule 7, subsection D, was wide open. I froze. The heavy metal barrier, which Ben had said held back the throat of the entity, was hanging off its hinges, bent outward as if something massive had simply walked through it. I shone my light into the opening. It wasn't a root cellar. It was a tunnel. Rough earth supported by rotting timber beams, descending further into the ground. Roots from the trees outside, the ancient pines, pierced through the ceiling of the tunnel, dangling down like severed nerves. They were pulsing. A faint, bioluminescent blue light traveled down the roots, beating something deep in the earth. I realized then the true horror of Blackwood Pines. The lodge wasn't haunted. The lodge was a hydroponic system. We were the gardeners, tending to a crop of nightmares that lived beneath the soil. Impressive, isn't it? The voice came from behind me. I spun around, raising the flashlight like a weapon. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway of the boiler room. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was wearing a heavy ceremonial robe made of stitched-together furs. Her face was calm, terrifyingly serene. She held a kerosene lantern in one hand and a long, curved carving knife in the other. Mrs. Gable, I breathed, stepping back toward the open furnace. You're part of this. I am the curator, Arthur, she said softly, stepping closer. The lantern light cast her shadow long and distorted against the wall. Ben was the warden. You were the steward. We all have our roles. The master must be fed. If he sleeps, the winter stays here. If he wakes, the winter spreads. Do you want the ice to cover the world, Arthur? Do you want your daughter in Chicago to freeze in her bed? She knew about my daughter. I had never told anyone at the lodge about my family. Rule 7 isn't about containment. I spat, gripping the red binder which I had shoved into my belt. It's about fattening them up. You're sacrificing us. Slowly. It is a necessary trade, Mrs. Gable said, her voice hardening. A few minds broken, a few souls consumed to keep the permafrost anchored here. You cannot burn the lodge, Arthur. Fire wakes him. Fire makes him angry. Ben is already possessed, I shouted. The system failed? He tried to kill me. Mrs. Gable's expression flickered. A moment of genuine sorrow crossed her face. Ben was weak. He let the cold in. He stopped fearing them and started pitying them. Pity is the crack in the armor. But I can fix it. I can install a new warden. After we deal with you. She lunged. For an older woman, she moved with unnatural speed, the knife flashing in the lantern light. I threw the flashlight at her face. It struck her cheekbone with a sickening crack, sending her stumbling back. The lantern fell, shattering on the concrete. Flames erupted, licking at the hem of her robe. I didn't wait to see if she recovered. I turned and sprinted, not toward the exit, but into the tunnel, into the throat. The tunnel was a nightmare of claustrophobia. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and sulfur. The pulsing roots brushed against my face, stinging like jellyfish. I ran until the tunnel opened up into a circular chamber carved directly into the bedrock. This was the vault, the Arch of Silas. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal. On it sat a glass canister filled with a liquid that glowed with a violent, unstable orange light. The severance accelerant. It wasn't just fuel. It looked like liquid anger. But standing between me and the pedestal was Ben. He was worse now. The possession had advanced. His skin was splitting at the seams, revealing frost-bitten blue flesh beneath. His jaw was unhinged, hanging loosely against his chest. He still held the fire axe, dragging it across the stone floor, creating a shower of sparks. Arthur, the thing wearing Ben, gurgled. End of the shift. I had no weapon. I had a letter opener in my pocket and a binder full of lies. I looked around the chamber. The walls were lined with wooden support beams, old and dry as bone. Ben raised the axe. He didn't rush. He knew I had nowhere to go. You're right, Ben, I said, my voice shaking but loud. Shift's over. Time to punch out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the marble. The glass cat's eye I had found after the encounter with the boy in the ballroom. Hey! I shouted, holding it up. Catch. I threw the marble hard, not at Ben, but past him, bouncing it off the stone wall behind him. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was sharp, rhythmic. For a split second, the entity inside Ben wavered. The boy, one of the many souls comprising the hive mind controlling him, reacted to the toy. Ben's head snapped toward the sound, the axe wavering in the air. That split second was all I needed. I didn't run for the pedestal. I ran for the support beam directly to Ben's left. I threw my entire body weight against it. It was a desperate gamble. The timber groaned, dust raining down. It held. Ben roared, the distraction broken. He swung the axe at me, a horizontal slash meant to take my head off. I ducked. The blade bit deep into the wooden beam I had just tackled. Thwack! The axe was stuck. Ben tugged at it, roaring in frustration. The vibration traveled up the beam to the ceiling of the cavern. I scrambled past him, diving for the pedestal. My hands wrapped around the cold glass of the canister. It felt like holding a live grenade. Mrs. Gable said fire wakes him. I yelled, pulling the cork from the canister. Let's see if he likes the heat. I didn't pour it. I smashed the canister against the pedestal. The glass exploded. The orange liquid splashed everywhere, over the stone, over the roots, and splashing onto Ben's legs. It didn't just ignite. It roared. It was a chemical fire, white-hot and instant. The liquid didn't need a spark. It reacted with the air. Ben screamed, a sound that wasn't human, a sound of 1,000 souls wailing in unison. The fire consumed him instantly, turning him into a living torch. The roots hanging from the ceiling caught fire, the flames racing up them like fuses, heading straight for the foundation of the lodge above. The cavern began to shake. The master was waking up. I backed away, shielding my face from the searing heat. The exit tunnel was blocked by the flailing, burning form of Ben. I was trapped in the oven. Then a hand grabbed the back of my collar. I spun around, expecting Mrs. Gable. It wasn't her. It was the maid. The woman from room 204. Her eyes were still sewn shut, but she wasn't attacking. She was pointing. She pointed to a narrow fissure in the rock wall, a crack barely wide enough for a person, hidden behind the pedestal. A draft of cold, fresh air was coming from it. Run, she whispered. Her voice wasn't raspy anymore. It was urgent. He burns. We leave. I didn't question it. The enemy of my enemy was my guide. I squeezed into the fissure just as the ceiling of the cavern began to collapse. The climb was brutal. It was a chimney of jagged rock, slick with ice. I clawed my way up, my fingernails tearing, my knees scraping raw. Below me, the fire roared like a jet engine, the heat rising, chasing me. I could hear the lodge above dying. I heard the crash of timber, the explosion of the boiler, the shattering of glass. I burst out of the ground into the freezing night air. I was in the woods, about 50 yards from the lodge. I collapsed into the snow, the cold biting into my burned skin. I rolled over and looked back. Blackwood Pines was a pyre. The fire wasn't orange. It was violet and white, consuming the structure with unnatural speed. The windows were blowing out one by one, and from every window, wisps of white smoke were escaping, shooting up into the night sky. Not smoke, souls, hundreds of them, finally released from the battery. But as I watched, the fire shifted. The flames gathering around the main chimney didn't dissipate. They began to coalesce. They swirled, knitting together, forming a shape. A massive burning hand rose from the collapsing roof. Fingers made of timber and flame clawed at the sky. Then a face formed in the smoke, a face the size of the lodge itself, with hollow eyes and a mouth that opened to swallow the moon. Silas Blackwood, or whatever thing had eaten Silas Blackwood. It wasn't dead. I hadn't killed it. I had just burned down its house, and now it was standing up. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline overriding the exhaustion. The entity turned its massive, fiery head. The hollow eyes looked down at the snow. They looked right at me. A sound wave of pure force hit me, knocking me back into the snow. It was a scream, but it wasn't sound. It was a telepathic command that drove a spike of ice into my brain. Where is my keeper? I turned and ran. I ran through the knee-deep snow, stumbling, falling, getting up again. I ran toward where I had parked my car 3 weeks ago, praying the keys were still in my pocket, praying the battery hadn't died in the cold. Behind me, the forest lit up as if the sun had risen. Trees exploded as the entity began to move, stepping out of the burning wreckage of its prison. I reached my car. It was a block of ice. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I dropped them in the snow. No, 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 I sobbed, digging frantically in the powder. I found them. I jammed the key into the lock. It froze. It wouldn't turn. The ground shook. Thump. A massive footstep. The heat was intense now, melting the snow around me. I breathed on the lock, my warm breath against the freezing metal. Please. I tried again. Click. I ripped the door open and threw myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered. The chug, chug, chug. Come on! I screamed, slamming my hand on the dashboard. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. A wall of fire and shadow tearing through the tree-line. It was huge. It was impossible. And it was reaching for the car. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into gear and floored it. The tires spun, whining on the ice, then caught gravel. The car fishtailed, then shot forward down the driveway. I didn't look back. I drove like a madman, sliding around the corners of the icy county road. The orange glow in my rearview mirror faded, but the sense of being watched didn't. I drove for hours. I didn't stop until I hit the lights of Duluth. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station, my hands fused to the steering wheel in a rigor of terror. I was alive. I had escaped. But as I sat there, under the harsh hum of the streetlights, I looked at the passenger seat. Sitting there, resting on the fabric, was the red binder. I hadn't brought it with me. I had left it in the basement. I had used it to shove into my belt, but I lost it in the tunnel. I stared at it. The cover was charred, smoking slightly. Slowly, terrifyingly, the cover of the binder opened on its own. The pages flipped, fluttering in the stillness of the car. They settled on the very last page, a page that had been blank before. Now, ink was appearing on the page, wet, black, and fresh. Writing itself before my eyes, Rule 8, it scrawled. The manager may leave the lodge, but the lodge never leaves the manager. See you soon, Arthur. I looked up into the rearview mirror. My own reflection stared back at me. But the eyes, my eyes were gone. In their place were black threads, sewn tight in a cross-stitch pattern. I screamed, but the only sound that came out was the crackling of fire. The scream that ripped from my throat was primal, a jagged sound that shattered the stillness of the gas station parking lot. I clawed at my face, my fingernails digging into my skin, expecting to feel the rough texture of black thread and the sting of a needle. But instead, I felt stubble, sweat, and the wet slick of melting snow. I blinked, gasping for air, and my reflection in the rearview mirror blinked back. My eyes were there, bloodshot, wide with terror, rimmed with soot, but they were open. They were mine. A sharp rap on the driver's side window made me jump so hard I slammed my knee against the steering column. A gas station attendant, a young kid with acne and a name tag that read Greg, was peering in, his face twisted in concern. "Hey, buddy," he muffled through the glass. "You all right? You've been screaming for like 20 seconds straight." I rolled down the window. The cold air hit me, but it didn't feel like the clean, sharp cold of Duluth. It felt like the damp, heavy cold of the lodge's basement. I'm fine," I stammered, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "Just a nightmare." Fell asleep. Greg looked at the soot covering my face, the burns on my jacket, and the frantic energy radiating off me. He didn't buy it, but he wasn't paid enough to care. Right. Well, you can't park at the pump if you're not pumping. Manager's watching. Leaving? I rasped. "I'm leaving right now." I threw the car into reverse, peeling out of the station. As I merged onto the highway, heading south toward Minneapolis and away from the Northwoods, I glanced at the passenger seat. The red binder was gone. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It was a hallucination. The stress, the smoke inhalation, the trauma. My brain was misfiring. I had burned the lodge. I had destroyed the vessel. It was over. I cranked the heat up, desperate to chase the chill from my bones, and turned on the radio to drown out the silence. But as the miles ticked by, the relief began to curdle into dread. The heat in the car was blasting at full capacity, but I couldn't get warm. It was a specific kind of cold. an internal frost that started in the marrow of my femurs and radiated outward. It was the same cold I had felt when standing in the lobby of Blackwood Pines during the silent observance. And the radio, it wasn't playing music. I had tuned it to a classic rock station, but the signal was drifting. Between the chords of a guitar solo, I heard it. Static. Pop. Hiss. And then a whisper buried in the white noise. Rule 7, subsection A. Warm the milk. I slammed my hand against the power button, killing the audio. The silence that rushed back into the car was heavy, pressurized. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was just interference. Just my mind playing tricks. I drove until my eyelids felt like lead shutters. I needed sleep. I needed a shower to scrub the smell of ozone and burnt meat from my skin. I pulled into a motel off I-35, a nondescript chain with flickering neon lights. It looked painfully, beautifully mundane. I checked in, paying cash. The room was generic. Beige walls, a floral bedspread, a smell of stale cigarettes. It was perfect. I locked the door, engaged the deadbolt, and propped a chair under the handle. Old habits. I went straight to the bathroom and turned the shower on as hot as it would go. Steam filled the small room, fogging up the mirror. I stripped off my ruined clothes, kicking them into the corner. I stepped under the spray, letting the scalding water beat against my back. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the feeling of Ben's grip, the sight of Mrs. Gable's serene smile as she burned. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back. For a moment, I felt safe. Then the water pressure changed. It dropped, then surged, and the sound changed. It wasn't the hiss of water anymore. It was a thicker, heavier splat. I opened my eyes. Running down my chest, swirling into the drain, was not water. It was a thick, milky white fluid. It smelled of sulfur and spoiled dairy. I scrambled backward, slipping on the porcelain, crashing out of the tub and onto the bath mat. I looked up at the shower head. It was sputtering, coughing up clots of the white liquid. No, I whispered, backing away until my back hit the sink. No, I left. I left. I turned to the mirror to wipe the fog away, to see if I was hallucinating again. My hand swept across the glass. Written in the condensation, in perfect block letters, was a message. The vessel is gone. The keeper remains. The letters began to weep, the condensation running down the glass like tears. I stumbled out of the bathroom, grabbing my keys. I had to go. I couldn't stay here. I had to get to my daughter. Sarah lived in Chicago. If I could just get to her, to the city, to the noise and the life, maybe it would drown this out. I threw my clothes back on, ignoring the dampness, and grabbed my bag. As I reached for the doorknob, I stopped. The chair I had propped under the handle was gone. It wasn't just moved. It was back at the small desk in the corner of the room. Sitting on the desk, squarely in the center, was the red binder. It wasn't charred anymore. It looked new. The leather was supple, the gold lettering crisp. Blackwood Pines, managerial protocols. I stared at it, my breath hitching in my throat. I backed away, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. I unlocked it and threw it open, sprinting out into the cold night air. I didn't care about my luggage. I didn't care about the bill. I just needed to put distance between me and that book. I got back on the highway, driving recklessly fast. I called Sarah. I needed to hear her voice. I needed an anchor to reality. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Hello? Her voice was sleepy, confused. Dad? It's like 4 a.m. Is everything okay? Sarah, I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. Sarah, listen to me. I'm coming to see you. I quit the job. I'm coming home. There was a pause on the line. Static crackled. Dad? She said, but her voice sounded different. Tinny. Distant. Dad. Why is there someone in the background? My blood froze. What? I'm in the car. I'm alone. No, she whispered. There's someone whispering. They're saying numbers. 7? Something about milk. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the display. The call timer was still running. "Sarah, hang up," I shouted. "Hang up the phone now. He says he's cold, Dad." Sarah's voice was flat now, losing its emotion. "He says you forgot the soldier. He says he wants to play tag. He says he's going to come find me since you won't play." I threw the phone out the window. It shattered on the asphalt behind me at 70 miles per hour. I screamed in frustration, slamming my hands on the steering wheel. They weren't just following me. They were using me as a conduit. By contacting her, I had opened a door. I couldn't go to Chicago. I couldn't go anywhere near people I loved. I was a typhoid Mary of the paranormal. The lodge wasn't a building. Ben had been right. It was a cage. And I had burned the cage, but the prisoners were chained to me. I swerved off the highway onto a dirt access road. I didn't know where it led. I just needed isolation. I drove until the road ended in a snow-covered clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. It looked disturbingly like the grounds of Blackwood pines. I killed the engine. The silence of the woods rushed in. I sat there for a long time, watching the snow fall. I waited for them to kill me. I waited for the cold to stop my heart or for a fire axe to come through the window. But death didn't come. Instead, a realization settled over me, heavier than the snow. They didn't want to kill me. If they wanted me dead, I would have died in the basement with Ben. They needed me. I looked at the passenger seat. The red binder was there. Of course it was. I picked it up. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I felt a strange, numb acceptance. I opened it to the last page, the one that had written itself in the gas station parking lot. Rule 8. The manager may leave the lodge. But the lodge never leaves the manager. Below that, new words began to appear, the ink bleeding onto the page as if coming from an invisible pen. Rule 9. The rituals must continue. The location is irrelevant. The observance is mandatory. Rule 10. If the walls are gone, the keeper must build new ones. You are the architect now. I looked up at the windshield. The frost was forming patterns on the glass. Not random geometric shapes, but faces. Agonized, screaming faces. The frost was spreading fast, turning the car into an igloo. The temperature was dropping. My breath was coming in thick white plumes. I understood then. The entity, the thing that ate Silas Blackwood, didn't live in the wood and stone of the lodge. It lived in the ritual. It lived in the fear and the order and the appeasement. It was a parasite of attention. By burning the lodge, I hadn't destroyed it. I had freed it from its physical tether. Now, it was tethered to the only thing left that knew the rules, me. I was the lodge. My mind was the library. My heart was the boiler. My soul was the basement. If I died, or if I ignored them, they would spread. They would go to Sarah. They would go to everyone I had ever known. The cold would expand until it covered everything. Okay, I whispered to the empty car. Okay, I get it. I opened the binder to the first page. Rule 1. Lock the main gates at 10 p.m. I looked at my watch. It was 4:33 a.m. I turned to Rule 7, subsection D. Checking the locks. I reached over and locked the car doors. Click. Click. The temperature in the car stabilized immediately. The faces in the frost stopped screaming and settled into a static pattern. The oppressive weight on my chest lifted, just an inch. Appeasement. I opened the glove box. I found a half-empty bottle of water and a packet of powdered creamer from a coffee stopped days ago. I mixed them in the cap of the water bottle. It wasn't warm milk, but it was an offering. I placed the cap on the dashboard. For the maid, I said softly. The liquid in the cap rippled, then vanished. I sat back, closing my eyes. I was exhausted, but I knew I wouldn't sleep. I had a job to do. I had to maintain the containment. I had to keep the schedule. But I couldn't do this forever. I was mortal. I would age. I would weaken. Eventually, I would slip up. I would miss a timing. And then the cold would get out. I needed a successor. I reached into the back seat and grabbed my laptop bag. I pulled out the computer. The battery was low, but I had a signal. I opened a browser and navigated to the same obscure job forum where I had found the listing for Blackwood Pines all those months ago. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and hot. But then I thought of Sarah. I thought of the tinny voice on the phone, the threat to play tag. I couldn't let it reach her. I needed someone else to carry the binder. Someone else to be the walls. I began to type. Title, remote security/management position available. High pay. No experience necessary. Description, looking for a solitary individual to manage a private estate. The location is mobile. The duties are specific. Must be detail-oriented and good with schedules. Night shift required. Warning, the employer is demanding. Strict adherence to provided protocols is mandatory for your safety. Do not apply if you are afraid of the dark. Do not apply if you don't believe in ghosts. I paused. I looked at the red binder sitting on my lap. It felt warm now, vibrating with a low purr. I added one last line. Must be willing to relocate immediately. The current manager is retiring. I hit post. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of the snow-covered woods. The sun was beginning to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and bloody orange. I wasn't Arthur anymore. I wasn't a father or a husband or a manager. I picked up the binder and held it to my chest. I waited for the sun to rise so I could close the curtains that didn't exist in a house that wasn't there. I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The stitches were back. But this time, I didn't scream. I just admired the needlework. It was tight, secure. Containment was holding. See you soon, I whispered to the applicant who hadn't applied yet. The rules are terrifying. But don't worry. I'll teach you. I started the car. I had to go find a toy soldier before midnight.